Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Hangout with the Buck Institute for Education. I'm John Larmer, the Editor-in-Chief at BIE. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a couple of great guests and a good topic, project-based teaching. That'll be our theme for the month for all of our Tuesday Hangouts this month. This Hangout will last about 30 minutes, and it'll be archived at bie.org if you want to see it again or tell people about it. And you can ask questions by posting them on our events page, which we might get to during the Hangout if there's a chance, or I might save some of them for the end. And if we don't answer your questions, you can always post them on the Google Plus events page, and we'll get to you after the Hangout. So thanks for joining us again. By the way, there is a blog on PBL teaching, project-based teaching, written by our executive director, John Mergenthaler. It just posted to our website, bie.org, yesterday. So if you want to check out that first in a series of blogs on project-based teaching, there it is. All right, so we got a couple of great guests today to talk about their project-based teaching, Emily Pilloton and Ramsey Musallam. So Emily, you're the founder of Project H, a great speaker at our PBL World Conference last June in Napa, so could you tell us about yourself?
Well, thank you for having me, and I am the founder of Project H. It's a nonprofit, and what we do is we use design and architecture to teach pretty much every subject through applied projects and to engage students through community-based architecture. So, for example, we've built farmers markets and classrooms for our own schools, and we try to use design and architecture to make core subject learning real and to try to build things that contribute to the community.
Okay, thanks, Emily. And Ramsey, tell us about yourself.
Hi, my name is Ramsey Musallam, and I teach high school chemistry at Sacred Heart Cathedral in downtown San Francisco. And I teach in somewhat of a traditional Catholic setting. All our students, it's a co-ed Catholic high school. They have 6 different classes. So one thing that I'm really passionate about is trying to work within that context to hack that system, if you will, to really build curiosity about subjects that students might not necessarily feel that curious about. So the way that I teach my class is I first start off by trying to spark student curiosity and challenge students to do things they might not necessarily have the skills to do. And then after that, I use technology or various forms of applications of that content to kind of build deep meaning. So, for example, we just finished a learning cycle on chemical bonding, and then after they synchronously worked together, we then did a project on soldering that came out of that. So in my work, it's kind of part synchronous, part asynchronous. I also run the Center for Inquiry and Innovation in our school, where we're putting on a TEDx youth event in January, and have a robotics team, and I basically work too much. So.
Okay. Oh, I should mention that both of our guests do have TED Talks you can check out on TED. And Ramsey, you mentioned soldering, which I imagine struck a bell with Emily. So she's big on welding and use of real tools with her kids. So, okay, we'll hear more about your projects in a second. But first, I wanted to begin with a question, this sort of a general question. What do you think are the characteristics of a good project-based teacher? So, Emily, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I was thinking about this question this morning, and I was thinking about some of my own high school teachers who, this is back in the 90s, and they didn't call it project-based learning. Maybe they just weren't using that term with us as students, but I remember doing some really amazing projects. My physics teacher, for example, we learned all the basic AP physics concepts through the Physics Olympics, and we had to build rockets and vessels that would go across the pool. And I think back on these projects and what it was about them that were so engaging, and it was the teaching. It was the excitement that the teacher brought to the content. I think it was also seeing the teacher as an expert of sorts, that they were doing the thing that they loved and they were really good at. And so that's one thing that I feel very lucky in my own work to get to do project-based learning in a field that I know really well, which is architecture. It's what I studied, it's what I do, it's what I did before I became an educator. So I think that one of the most important things for any project-based learning teacher is just excitement about the content and a level of expertise, but also at the same time the willingness to continue to learn. That I do know a lot about architecture, but my students often pose questions to me that I don't know the answer to, and I have to be able to say, you know what, I don't know, let's go find out. And so I think balancing those two things of expertise and constant inquiry, just being really excited to like frame different problems, solve different problems, and to be sort of in it with your students and figure things out together.
Okay, thanks, Emily. Ramsey, what are your thoughts on a good project?
I completely agree. I was at high school in the 90s as well. And, you know, I could say the same things about my physiology teacher. I remember it was just incredible. You know, for me, I tend to get really nerdy with answers like this and kind of go cognitive, but I feel like a good project-based teacher is somebody who, first off, I think doesn't really think about the word PBL or inquiry, more just thinks about the idea of what does good teaching look like, and how can I get my students applying what they do to other situations that are meaningful to them and to the world. That's one, but I think even before that, you know, the term driving question is sort of thrown around a lot in the PBL world, and I think that oftentimes we feel like if we teach students how to write driving questions and we provide the right materials, that they're going to want to do that suddenly. And I think that this idea of understanding that, at least in my school, when students have 6 different periods, that getting students curious and motivated to do a project is difficult work at times. And I think the idea that curiosity is this weird thing that's part cognition and then it's part affect. Like, when somebody's curious, they're really motivated to do something, but their brain has a gap that needs to be filled. And that we as teachers we can create that. Like, we can manipulate the surroundings so that they feel both of those things. And I think that really needs to come first for me before the project, as exciting as it might be. So I think that's the way we can really build a deep content knowledge in the context of it. So I think the driving question is something that really needs to be curated by the teacher, and that's setting up that and establishing that setting with students who are very busy is tricky work. So it's more of an art, I would say, if anything.
Yeah, I can tell it's more of an art. You're right. Students with 6 periods a day, no matter how exciting you think your project is, they might think, oh boy, here we go, another project in this period.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. Let's get to 2 questions now. I want to get into more detail, more sort of concrete detail about project-based teaching. So the first one is more about, you know, designing and thinking about the project ahead of time as a teacher, and then the second question will be more about how it actually unrolls with students. Mm-hmm. So what does project-based teaching look like when you're designing and planning a project? Emily, how about back to you there?
Yeah, you know, God, it's messy. It's really messy. But I say that, you know, all of the projects that we do with our students, who are mostly high school students, but we have some middle school students also, we build architecture. And so the first question that we often ask our students is, what does our community need? And so asking that question, we don't know what they're going to say. We don't know what their answer is going to be. So it makes it very difficult to say at the beginning of the year, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. Because there has to be that room in there for students to identify the thing that they're interested in, the thing that they identify as a need, and to be able to carry that all the way through. So, for example, this year we're building a tiny home, like a 8 by 16 foot home, like fully outfitted with all the utilities on a trailer that will be donated to this nonprofit. And so at the beginning of the year, we didn't quite know exactly what that was going to look like, or if it was going to be on a trailer, if it was going to be on a foundation, if it was going to be a home or something else. And so the planning process was really myself, the instructor, and our project manager sitting down and saying, okay, what are the concrete things that we know we have to hit? How are we going to teach structures? How are we going to teach applied mathematics? How are we going to teach community-based research? And then knowing that those things have to happen, but then also knowing that the way we get from one point to the next is completely undetermined and has to have room for student input. So we were going to teach drafting and modeling and all these things, but the what of it was really up to the students. If they said, we want to do something that's entirely solar powered and made out of plastic bottles, we have to be able to flexibly build that into the curriculum. So I think the best thing that I've learned about planning these projects is knowing the things that are fixed and knowing the things that are flexible, and knowing that whatever the students throw at you, you're going to be able to work that into the things you already know you want to teach.
So, Emily, you don't map out a project too tightly then in terms of the calendar. You have a certain window of time. You've got learning goals, you said, but you don't actually map out things in detail, at least on a day-to-day basis, right?
Well, this is actually the first year we've tried to assign like specific dates and deadlines to things. The very first year when we built the farmers market in rural North Carolina, that we really didn't have a plan. I mean, we knew like by December we had to have construction documents, and by June we had to have a building permit, and it had to open in September. But other than that, the teaching part of it was really wide open. This year we've said, okay, by the end of Q1, which is next week, we need to have a design figured out, and then by December we need construction documents, and within that gap it's down to the week, like we're going to do framing first, and then the plumbing fixtures, and then this, and then that. So yes, I mean, we actually have, for the first time this year, really dialed in like what we need to hit. But the design is totally up for debate. So that's the part where we have to leave room for flexibility, because if we're building something out of wood, that's going to change the way we create construction documents. So we have to be flexible enough to say, okay, that's a great idea, let's move it to construction documentation. We have to get there by December, but the way in which we do that might change based on the things that the students are excited about.
Okay. And Emily, are you teaching in a team? How many teachers, and do you plan together, I presume?
Yeah, we have a full-time middle school teacher who has a 6th grade class, a 7th grade class, and an 8th grade class, and then we have a high school teacher who teaches 4 class periods every day. So we have a total of about 200 students every day. And then I have a project manager whose background is in construction management, and she helps a lot with like the project management Gantt chart planning. And then I do a lot of the fundraising and sort of like big picture, putting building blocks in place and stuff.
Okay.
So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned Gantt charts just then, right?
Yeah.
We have one of our viewers
on our wall. Yeah.
Okay, one of our viewers just asked a question which mentioned Gantt charts. Doug asked about the real-life experiences you build into a project. So things like Gantt charts, elevator pitches, and so forth. Is that part of what you build into a project?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we follow all the building codes. We have to build a structure that exists in the world. And so we have a Gantt chart. We have a budget. Our students know how much money we have left within that budget. When they go to choose a door or a specific piece of hardware, they need to know where it's going to come from, how much it's going to cost. And we talk a lot about making deliberate decisions. Like any decision you make as a designer, you have to be able to justify. So all that fits into both the Gantt chart planning, the budgeting, the restrictions that the city of Berkeley puts on us, which are, massive. So all these things are constraints that our students work within.
Okay. All right, thanks. Ramsey, how about you? What does it look like from your point of view of project-based planning and designing projects ahead of time?
Much more boring than that. That was amazing. Should I share my screen?
Yeah, sure.
Love that. Okay, so I have a little. What I'm going to do is share with you the logic that I use in my AP chemistry class, because I think that's a good. It kind of polarizes the process a little bit, because I have a subject that is extremely dense, and I have to work at a certain pace. So I think it's nice to show how I try and fit project-based learning and inquiry into that. So I think much like Emily and her team, I have to be really strategic, because in AP Chemistry, for example, there's a bunch of content that they just have to know. Not only ethically, I have to be teaching at a college level, but also, I want the students to, at the minimum, be positioned to pass the AP test. So what we're really trying to do with this model is shoot way beyond and kind of treat the AP exam or college credit, if you will, as sort of the lowest bar, and really shoot beyond that to try and create deep meaning. So what I do in my class is I do, if if we want to throw out labels here, I do a hybrid of kind of an inquiry learning cycle, and you can see that at the top with the blue, green, and brown boxes, and then that leads into your traditional project. So this setup is designed to try and spark curiosity and create deep content knowledge, and then extend that knowledge outwards using the project. So I'm using the project as more of a deep connection or application of the content, assuming that they already have an interest, because that's what the top cycle is designed to do. So, for example, I use we just finished a unit on chemical bonding. So the students in step 1, we spent a day exploring the physical characteristics of different substances that bonded differently, whether it was, you know, metallic bonding and alloys or covalent compounds, and they built models, and they built hypotheses as to how they thought those things bonded based on their physical characteristics. After that, we went into some student delivery of their models to try and come together with a consensus, and then I delivered some direct instruction. That's what you see there in the green box. I use direct instruction as sort of spackling, if you will. So once we know what their misconceptions are, then I'll strategically think about what content needs to be delivered. Usually this is in the form of equations or definitions. You know, here's what a covalent bond looks like, here's how the electrons bond, etc. And then we move into the third day, which is application of that. So this is where the students are doing a lot of your traditional problem solving, bookwork, if you will. So released AP problems, you know, higher level creation problems, etc. And then normally this is where it would kind of end with the inquiry cycle, and you go into back through that piece in a traditional AP class. So then what I try and do is, rather than loop back around to the next topic, then we extend that outwards with something that kind of shoots beyond the AP test. So in this case, the students seem to be really interested in metallic bonding. So we went and we did a project on soldering, and we talked about alloys on a really deep level. We talked about substitutional versus interstitial alloys, and we soldered together some circuits. And this is where the students' voice and choice really came into play. So when we were heading through this cycle, I was kind of watching them and having conversations with them, and trying to sniff out where their interest lied. And then I then presented them with soldering as sort of like an overarching skill in the world. I took apart some circuit boards and showed them where the solder was, so they had kind of that was the entry event. You know, this is where it's used, and then provided them with some options at that point, and they got to choose what they wanted to do with that skill. And then all my students do all their work on a blog. So then the students blogged out their projects, and that was kind of the public display of that knowledge, and they looked at each other's and revised them. So this took about 2 days, and you know, in my mind, it was 2 days well spent. We might not get through as much content, but it sort of takes a dry AP curriculum and it layers on top of it this PBL, if you will, that helps them remember that there's some applications of that content. So we extend the cycle out like this, usually about once a month, I would say.
Okay.
That's how I start.
You can go back to yourself, your own picture there, Ramsey, on the screen. I'd like to hear a couple more examples of your projects, but let me hear those in the context maybe of our next question, which is about what project-based teaching looks like when you're actually in the thick of it with students. So Emily, I'll go back to you for some thoughts on that. What's it like when you're actually in the middle of a project? How do you work as a PBL teacher?
Yeah, you know, as Ramsey was talking, I was thinking like about just the time frame of, you know, he's talking about days, and I was thinking like, oh, most of our projects have to span a whole year. So it's also like, I wish I had, you know, that kind of condensed time frame sometimes. But as far as students go, I think because most of our projects extend for the entire academic year, and we have them for the entire academic year, and we have to keep them excited the entire academic year, it really is about trust, about intimacy, like finding the thing that really lights up a specific student and then making sure that that's always available to them. So like the farmers market project that I mentioned, that was our first big architectural project. I had one student who like wanted nothing to do with, she didn't want to get her hands dirty, she didn't want to pick up a piece of wood, she didn't want to learn how to weld, but she was obsessed with drawing letters and typography. And so she became like the graphic documentarian for that project. And so, but I had to really like sit with her and talk to her and understand what was exciting to her in order to see that as something that she could, a medium that she could learn through. So, you know, all students are different. I think the beauty of project-based learning is it does allow for different entry points, and especially with architecture, like I'll see students who are obsessed with welding, and then a student who only wants to take photos, and a student who only wants to write written documentation, and all those things are really, really important. But, you know, when I'm sitting with a student, I have to have a sense of trust with them, and I do think design and the way that we structure our program is based on that kind of student relationship, that in moments where we don't know the answer or they don't know the answer, we can look each other in the eye and say, like, we don't know the answer right now, but that's why we're here. We're here to figure it out, and we have to trust each other in order to do that. And, you know, I also work with a group of kids who come from some really difficult family situations, who have, you know, financial barriers in their way, and some of them walk into our classroom with a little bit of like, you know, who are you and why should I trust you kind of attitude. And that's exciting for me though, because I think that project-based learning creates the space in which we're creating something together. So just lastly, with the tiny home projects, one of the ways that we try to build that trust is to talk about housing on a very, very personal level. Like a lot of our students that come from Richmond who are living in multi-generational housing, we talk about that. Like, what's the size of your living space? Where's your grandmother? How do we use housing as a way to be together, to build environments together? And that's something that's very personal to them. Some of them have been homeless, you know, so that's a very personal issue, and we try to use the content to get them both excited and also inquisitive about the bigger issues when we talk about something as universal as housing. So that, I think it all comes down to trust, and it all comes down to listening and just like making the commitment to find the one thing that excites a student and giving them that thread throughout the entire project.
Okay. All right, thanks, Emily. Ramsey, how about your thoughts on what it's like to be a PBL teacher during a project?
Again, I feel like mine's totally boring, but I think it's good for the audience to see, you know, these two different examples of how it might play out in two different settings, because I'm just listening to you talk and getting so envious of what you do. But and I have your book right here, which I love. You know, for me, again, I really like to tease out the difference between an inquiry learning cycle and sort of your typical PBL framework. So what you see in my class is you see a very intentionally designed, structured process where the teacher has kind of curated moments for kids. So what you're going to see in my class is you really will see, in the soldering example, you would see 3 days that are very synchronous. So if you walked in on the first day, you would see students exploring a phenomena in sort of like a pseudo fashion. You know, it's not necessarily connected to the world. They just had 6 different compounds that they were trying to understand how they bonded and building ideas around that. And then if you came in the middle day, you would see me doing a little bit more of your traditional instruction. Usually that piece I do in a form of a video. But for the sake of this talk, let's just assume that I'm doing it as a lecture in class. And then the next day, you'd really see them doing kind of boring bookwork. It would look more like a study hall. Like I'd be walking around, we'd be whiteboarding things. But what you first would see is the synchronous piece where the direct instruction was delayed, and that's the biggest characteristic of inquiry learning, I would say, is that much like any movie, any hero's journey, the mentor comes later, right? So in this setting, the teacher, my role as the teacher, the holder of information, comes a little bit later. Okay, so you would see the synchronous beginning portion where I would have more activity later on as their misconceptions are tackled and addressed, and then you would see 2 or 3 more days that would look very workshop-y, where the students are now working on their projects. So you might have some students building a battery and soldering that, or some students working with Arduino soldering that, or some students you know, resoldering some Christmas lights or building jewelry. So that was the way this went. So I would say, in my case, you would see a synchronous phase designed to create deep inquiry, and then you'd see a project-based learning phase that would appear a little bit more workshop-y and open-ended. That would conclude with your formal assessment, and then I'd begin that over again. So I tweeted out that link, and this model that I showed earlier can be found on my blog as well, which is cyclesoflearning.com. And if you just go to research or resources and then go down to models, you could see that there. But
okay.
That's the synchronous and asynchronous appearance would be the main thing you'd see.
All right, Ramsey, there's a question from Nick about, do you have students actually, when they write their blogs or journal or so forth, maybe Emily too, do you ask students to actually discuss how they're addressing standards or building 21st century skills while they're doing the project? Is that sort of an explicit thing you have them write about in a journal or a blog?
That's a really good idea. No, you know, a lot of that happens in, you know, as this is all happening, the students have a big practice set of problems that they're working through, and they have a practice quiz that they're working on, and they're reassessing. And that's usually the way that I address that. I really try not to. The blogs are peer reflection. So if you went to my class website, which you can find on my blog, cyclesoflearning.com, all the students' blogs are linked there on the homepage. So we make a big point in my class about publicly curating your digital footprint. So every student's blog is posted there live on my site. And I ask them to write open-ended reflections on the things they understood, the things they didn't understand, the things that they want to do better next time, things that caught their eye. So if you went there right now, you could actually look at their writing.
Okay, all right, thanks. We're getting close to the end of a half hour, but I want to explore this one question toward the end here. So what are some challenges that you face as a project-based teacher, or you think that perhaps project-based teaching in general presents for teachers? How do you overcome those challenges? Emily?
You know, it's just challenging work, and I think that for our program, what's been most challenging for me is basically reinventing the wheel every year, and challenging but like incredibly exciting. So we're building a tiny home this year. We may or may not build a tiny home next year. We may do something completely different. So I think keeping the content really fresh and exciting is always a challenge, but still maintaining a certain consistency of rigor and content. And it's, you know, it's also, most projects that we've done have been very material heavy. Also just like, you know, having shipments of lumber delivered, and just, it's challenging to keep everything in balance. And then I also, I've seen that there's some resistance with other teachers to collaborate with us in ways that feel uncomfortable to them. And so we may go to like the pre-calculus teacher and say, you know, we're doing this project, and there are these points of intersection with what you're teaching. Can we collaborate and try to find ways to co-teach that content? And not every teacher, but some teachers will just be like, no, like you do your thing and I'll do mine. So while I love collaborating with my team, I have found some challenges in collaborating outside of our team with teachers that maybe aren't as comfortable doing PBL. So that's something that I'm hoping, you know, there are teachers though who are really excited about it. But I think the challenge of collaborating across subjects is really exciting. And then, as I said in my previous answer, you know, just finding ways for every student to be excited about what we're doing. and when that's 30 different things that they're excited about, that's a lot of balls to keep in the air. But for the most part, I think all these challenges are really great. You know, they're the kinds of challenges we want to have, not things that set us back.
Okay. I'm glad you ended with that thought. Good one. Ramsey, how about you? Challenges and how you overcome them?
Well, I think I can speak more from the frame of reference of a traditional teacher, you know, in a traditional setting. Given, let's say, chemistry or AP chemistry, for example, I think that there's this tendency to, when you start applying these different pedagogies, whether they be inquiry learning, modeling, project-based learning, you know, there's so many different frameworks that each one is associated with. Even the one that I showed you is kind of one that I sort of like hodgepodge together. But I think there's this tendency to want to lock yourself into a way of teaching, and you forget that sometimes you have to just back up and just lecture, because that is what you just need to do right now. And I think it's reminding yourself that you can do a lot of really interesting, motivating projects and inquiry with your students, but you don't have to all the time. And if you don't all the time, it doesn't make you a bad teacher. It doesn't make you not committed to real life connections. I mean, a great example is today. I had a whole project on, or a whole inquiry entry moment on drawing covalent bonds. So we now are doing a whole thing on Lewis structures, which is a way of drawing covalent molecules. And I had this whole thing set up around surface tension of water, and it just was failing because they just couldn't get past the mechanics that layered underneath. So I had to just stop and just do like a back and forth lecture practice thing, and it just scratched everything I did. And I think in the past I would have sat there and just muscled through the project because, like, that's the kind of teacher I say I am, versus just going, you know what, I'm just going to rock a traditional method right now because that's what they're yearning for. So that kind of flexibility I think is important, because it's important to remember that, like, I don't know, I mean, I think it's good to give things labels, but I think at the end of the day they're just labels. Like, good teaching, just, you know what it looks like and feels like when it's happening. And sometimes that means doing things that you might not think are part of that label. So.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We had a question about translating the language of project management, the process of project management, to the context of education, and maybe more in depth than we have time for today. But I suspect, Emily, you probably do sort of teach project management skills and even use the language of project management in your work. Is that correct?
Yeah, we do. And, you know, coming from an architectural background and looking at Gantt charts and having to understand, you know, the way a construction project happens and how things overlap and have to happen in certain orders, I think that maps really nicely over a unit plan or even over an entire school year. And things like the design thinking process, which have, you know, I have mixed feelings about design thinking, but when you look at it in its purest form, it's different modes and phases of doing things, and that's very similar to the way we talk about project management, that you do one thing and that allows you to do the next thing, and sometimes those things overlap. I think more than anything, though, it's just about clarity and transparency and always having students understand where they are in the process. That's why we put the Gantt chart on the wall, and there's like a marker for the day. Like, today we are right here, and tomorrow we will be right here. And that is the most important thing about project management, I think, for our students, is just seeing progress and knowing that the thing they're doing today is going to help them do the thing tomorrow. Okay.
All right, thanks. So I'll come back to you guys for a final word in a moment, but let me just start to wrap this up. So viewers out there, this is archived at BIE.org if you missed a part of it or want to pass it along to someone else. And we'll be having another hangout next week on Tuesday, October 14th at noon Pacific time, and also the topic of project-based teaching. And our guests next week will be Stephen Ritz, who is the mastermind behind the Green Bronx Machine, a teacher and former teacher, now heads that organization in New York City. And that'll be very entertaining, I'm sure, knowing Stephen. And joining him will be Myla Lee, who's a member of our BIE National Faculty and an elementary school teacher. So look forward to seeing you in a week, same time, same channel. As I mentioned, you can offer comments or post questions on the Google Plus events page. We'd be glad to answer them after the Hangout. Let me just come back to how about Ramsey first for a final word?
Well, thank you guys very much for having me today. I think that if there's one thing I could say to just teachers out there, from my experience, specifically science teachers, is that in my mind, I find that curating that sense of curiosity in the classroom is something that can be done really strategically, and I think that really taking the time to put students in a position where they experience kind of an information gap can be a really powerful way to drive them towards more content and then facilitate deep learning through projects. So I think the longer we delay our direct instruction, but the more strategic we are about curating that environment, I think it can be a really fun way to lesson plan. I think as a teacher, I used to really say, like, I'm going to go day to day to day, and then now I'll do a project, versus really rolling it out in a sequence, a cycle, if you will. Has really been empowering for me, a really fun way to plan, and it makes my job less overwhelming because I feel like I have a sense of direction where I'm going. And it's a lot of fun. I mean, and also for AP teachers out there, I think that there's a tendency to really teach towards the test, and I think by doing deep projects like this, them getting prepared for the test or the end result, if you will, is sort of a natural side effect. When you do this, you're really shooting past that, and it's really exciting. So that was my final word. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ramsey.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking your time during your lunch hour at school. Emily, how about a last word from you?
Yeah, I was just listening to the way Ramsey talks about project-based learning. It's really interesting to me because I don't come from a traditional educational path. I'm coming to all of this from the field of architecture. So, first of all, I just really appreciate hearing the kind of rigor and planning that you put into your work. And I think as I was listening to him, I think this is sort of the essence of PBL, that we're all learning from each other and we're all really excited about teaching. And I think that because PBL, for some teachers and some teachers that I've worked with directly, is a little bit scary. It's a little bit nebulous. It's, it feels uncomfortable sometimes. But in my experience, the things that have felt uncomfortable are the things that are like the most wonderfully enlightening for us and for students. So the thing that I love about PBL is just pushing myself as a teacher, seeing the way that students respond when I walk in and say, let's do something crazy, like let's just try this thing we've never tried before. So I guess I would encourage other teachers to also do the things that they are excited about, to do the things that they love, and to try to push our own practice. Because students pick up on that. When they see us excited, when they see us like trying new things, they're also more excited to match that energy. So I think that's something that is very unique to PBL, because we are uncovering things together. So I'm excited to be part of the conversation with Ramsey and the Buck Institute and everyone who's listening. I wish I knew who you were, but thank you for having me.
All right, thanks, Emily. Yeah, I like how you both really show that project-based teaching, while it's challenging and difficult in some ways, it's also fun and rewarding and fulfilling for you as teachers. That really came through. So thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.